Good morning. A new report has been released by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. This report has been being in the works for about 2 years now. And basically, what they've determined is that there's been a patterns and practice of racial discrimination by the Minneapolis Police Department. And no, we're not surprised. This confirms, affirms a lot of things that we both have observed with our own eyes, heard from members of the community and whatnot. But for me, I feel like the publishing of this report is what journalists need in order to say that there is corruption within the Minneapolis Police Department. And I have hesitated since the murder of George Floyd to use that word because as a Black journalist, I will be called an activist. But if I were a white journalist saying that, I'd be a great journalist then. But this is the kind of evidence that folks across the country need in order to use that narrative, which is accurate. Right. But when you think about the dozens of people that we have talked to on the ground who have said that they were brutalized by the Minneapolis Police Department, you have evidence. Remember the case of Jaleel Stallings, who during the protests, police, came and brutally beat him just because they were driving by. And we heard on the body cameras, white officers saying that they were going to hunt protesters, right? But there's so much documentation that has come out. Even looking at Chauvin had about 7 or 8 victims that we know of that have been documented before before George Floyd. There's so much documentation. Then when you double down and look at the fact that the police lied about what happened to George Floyd, and what they did to Amir Locke, calling him a suspect, even though he was not. I mean, the paintings are on the wall. We've talked about this on this show, case by case, incident by incident. Here is this cohesive report by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights that say, yes, we have found, after researching for the last 2 years, patterns and practices of racial discrimination by this department. What more evidence do people need in order to call corruption corruption?
That's right. That's right. Good morning, Sister Ford. I am reminded of the Department of Justice investigation into Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown, who was shot by Officer Darren Wilson. The report was very similar. It showed that the people of Ferguson, who were predominantly Black in population, but run by a predominantly white city commission, the Black people in that city were targeted more by police. They were stopped more frequently. They were questioned. They were detained more frequently. And it just showed a pattern and a practice of exploiting the Black community for funding the city's budget. What I'm hearing from Minneapolis, Minnesota, it sounds so similar. And so it's so disturbing to know that these patterns are replicating themselves across the country when it comes to how Black people are treated by the police.
Well, then here's the larger question. If we can do these isolated explorations, we can go into Ferguson, DOJ can investigate there, the Department of Human Rights here investigates here. And also there's still the DOJ investigating here too. But we have all of these independent individual investigations that are proving that there are problems. When is there going to be a nationwide research done and acceptance that there needs to be an overhaul? Because this no longer, as we've seen over the last 10 years, this is the issues that communities of color are having with police is not isolated to one city, one county, or one state. These are problems that are existing, that are showing relevant all across the country.
That's right.
So while we can go in department by department and turn the stone over, do some research, find out basically what we already knew, at what point are they going to do a collective study across the country and see if there's enough evidence to say that there's a nationwide problem? And I hate to say this because I feel like we collectively decided there was a problem 2 years ago after the murder of George Floyd, but the George Floyd Policing Act still hasn't been passed on a federal level.
That's right.
So
that's right.
So do we need more evidence? Because, okay, we found out, okay, Minneapolis Police Department's a problem. Okay, we can fix that the same way we fix Ferguson. But what about Baltimore? What about Chicago?
Right.
What about Atlanta? What about the Louisiana State Police who lied and said that Ronald Green died in a car crash when really 2 years later, when the media got the body camera footage, they found out that the police brutally beat him to death? This isn't isolated to just Minneapolis, to your point. Yes, it's Ferguson. Yes, it's Baltimore, Atlanta, Chicago, Louisiana, you name it. There's a systemic problem here with the structure of policing across the country. And I thought we agreed we were going to address it 2 years ago, but here we are.
That's right.
And it seems like the finish line keeps getting moved further and further back.
Exactly right. Because you have to understand, the audience, everyone, just take into consideration, our fight for Black lives comes into direct competition with police officers' agenda. Every time we make a move towards justice for Black life, we see the full force of police unions, of political parties, of all types of organizations who help move that goalpost, Georgia. Every time we get a little bit closer to justice, they change the paradigm. And so now we're not only having conversations about whether or not police officers should stop killing us, we're giving them more money. Right? The goalpost has been moved so far that not only is there no accountability, we're still rewarding the people who are systematically killing us on a regular basis.
And then you have situations like what happened in Grand Rapids with Leoya, Patrick Leoya. And the thing that I have seen is, since the murder of George Floyd and being so close to this issue and covering police killing after police killing after police killing, you see a shift in the minds of people who at one point were on the side of the issue where they knew something dramatic needed to happen, whether it was reform or abolishing, right? I've seen the transformation of the minds. People are like, something has to change. Well, then all of a sudden crime goes up. Well, no, actually, let's keep the police and let's just do some diversity training. Right. Or, oh my God, this is terrible. Abolish the police because they were slave catchers and they're here just to kill us. To, well, that person shouldn't have done X, Y, Z, and they would still be alive. And so the passing of time without any action being taken has also fractured the collective, the unified voice that was there, right? The passing of time has allowed enough other events to happen to change people's minds. Think about it. If you stand in a line for an hour, you might change your mind on whether or not you really want what you came for. If you have to stand in line for 2 years for change, are you going to keep standing in that line asking for the same thing? Or are you going to get distracted and see something else happening and say, well, actually, we don't need all of this change anyways. Let's kind of keep things the way it is. And so I've seen people who were so dead set on something has to change fundamentally in our nation 2 years ago to now the crime or, one justified police killing. And people are like, well, it's not that bad. But it keeps happening. And now you get studies like this from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights that say there's a pattern and practices of racial discrimination within this department. So fundamentally, why should we keep it the same if now we have evidence and proof? I've talked to people in the community, so I already knew these things. But for some reason, we have to have researches and studies done for people to believe Black women, for people to believe Black men, right? So now we have this. Why should we keep something the same that has proven to be racist?
As I hear you talking, Georgia, all I hear is Dr. King in my ear saying justice delayed is justice denied. Because in those 2 years, people who have been fighting for justice, some of them have died. How many people have been fighting for justice in this country, and before they even got an idea of justice, they died? And this is part of the game. Part of the game is to delay Black people in this country as much as we possibly can. I'm also reminded of Toni Morrison, who said the purpose of white supremacy is to occupy our time, to slow us down, to waste our time. So not only are we fighting on one front, trying to get justice and keep police officers from killing us, but you're absolutely right. We're fighting on a second front, and that's a temporal front, a time front, because these people know if they can just stall us as long as they possibly can, they can have an entire life of freedom when they should have been in jail for the crimes they committed against Black people.
That's right. There's been 3 Black people who were killed in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. Do you know their names? There has now been this study that has come out that has proven that the department has a history of being racist. Have you heard about that from any other news source besides here? Those are also critical questions that people need to be asking themselves, because the international media flocked into this community after the murder of George Floyd. Are they following this story now? Are they continuing to amplify the developments, the nuances, the complexities of this issue? Or have they moved on to the next news cycle? And so for me, Ben, that's why I continue to follow this, because it's just as important today as it was 2 years ago. Because to your point, justice delayed is justice denied. And had there have been a significant change 2 years ago, someone like Amir Locke would still be here.
That's right.
Because I know that on the ground, community leaders here presented bills. They drafted bills. They got more than 50,000 signatures for bills to be passed. One of them included no-knock warrants.
That's right.
Because of what happened to Breonna Taylor. They could look at that situation and see that fundamentally legislation needed to change in order to prevent something like that from happening here. They were not heard. They were not listened to. The signatures didn't matter to lawmakers. And so while maybe there were 1 or 2 things that passed through, it was watered down. And the significant change that was needed, like that bill, no-knock warrants, it got thrown to the wayside. That one change could have saved at least what we know of today, 1 life. So, we're going to continue to follow it. The DOJ's research has not been released yet. I don't think they've concluded their investigation. So we're going to continue to look out for that. But I'm guessing on a state level, if state investigators can find patterns and practices of racial discrimination, I'm guessing the federal government is going to find worse.